Can I just begin, Peter, by maybe just asking you to reflect on what it's like sitting in this auditorium 44 years later and watching the play that I guess kind of changed your life, really?
It did change our lives completely. I mean, I'd been a television writer up to that time. It was 1967. And Michael Blakemore had been a friend of mine. He was a personal friend. And he wrote and said, you know, have you got any plays? Because we want to do new plays, not just ones that have been done before. So if you've got any new ones, can you send it to us? I sent him this one, which had been rejected by everybody in the country. And he managed to get it pushed through the committee. And did a marvellous production of it, I thought. I didn't work with him on it, but I worked with him on the script before. He was the kind of director who helps develop the play, you know? He wasn't just somebody who sort of does it once it's done. So it was very organic and it was very close. I mean, actually, his son had been lying on a bed in his flat when he was a baby. And our daughter had been lying beside him. And it was at this moment that we actually realized the difference between our daughter and a healthy child. And we said, you know, she's torpid, she's not very active. And so that was the first time, and it was Michael's son that really pointed that out to us. And anyway, we did it. Michael did it here wonderfully, I thought. And I actually sat down there somewhere doing a run in working lights, no set, the set of the play that they were doing at that moment, which because it was repertory, and just very bare, nothing, hardly any scenery, no scenery at all really, just some tables and stuff. And they did the first act. Joe Melia and Zena Walker did the first act. And at the end of it, Michael got up and walked over and said, how do you feel about that? And I have very rarely cried in my life. My adult life, I've only cried about 3 times. Once was at Fred Astaire dancing, because you can laugh, you can cry at perfection as well. And I cried at that, and I cried at 1 or 2 other productions, and this one, which, oddly enough, I've not cried about our daughter in real life. And it was the strange experience of it being rendered into art by these 2 actors that made me, that gave it an extra dimension, which, you know, there's a lovely story about Francois Truffaut, the French film director, and somebody said, why don't you go to parties? And he said, because they're so badly directed. Which I think is a profound statement about life and art and what you can make of it. And my wife and I came along, she came up from Bristol. We'd neither of us been concerned with it before, and she came up from Bristol and we sat up there, I think, I'm pretty sure. And a woman behind us was saying, oh, this is good, there's Zena Walker, there's Joe Melia, and this one, he doesn't seem to be in it. Oh, he's got 3 children and a cat. That's nice. Anyway, they were going away to Bermuda this year. They said they would like to make a change. And then the play started. And the act that you've just seen tonight, the first act, took place. And the one that had made me cry. And as the curtain finished and Sheila walked off with the child, and the audience sat like that, and this woman said, so this year they think they're going to go to Cyprus.
Can I just ask you about, you know, obviously the play, you know, examines a very sensitive issue, and in 1967 we still had a Lord Chamberlain, and you say the play had been rejected by lots of other theatres. I imagine that was to do with the subject matter. So how, was there a journey to actually being able to get the play on, to getting it passed by the Lord Chamberlain?
Yeah.
And what was the sort of response both from the audience and the press to the subject matter and the way that it was dealt with in the play?
Well, it was the sense, as usual, was that the censor was more horrified than the audience. And Michael and I had to go along to St James's Palace, which was then the home of the Lord Chamberlain, who was the censor. And they were two army officers. Well, one army officer, one RAF officer. And they handed out Nelson cigarettes, you know, and on it. And there was a guardsman walking up and down outside with a Busby and a rifle. And we sat there saying, on page 8, could you sign something else instead of sod off? You know. So we were sitting here discussing filth, really. I mean, he was what somebody called the royal smut hound. And the magic word in censorship is, if in doubt, take it out, which is lovely because, you know, of the double entendre. And so we sat there, Michael and I sat there arguing on page 5, you know, and it made that when he submitted his objections to the play, it made it sound like a piece of filth, you know, because if you take out every objectionable article throughout a long play and put it all on one page, it sounds as if he'd written a piece of filth. I later, in fact, we got it through. He made one ruling. He said, we do not want the child to be on stage when the parents discuss going to bed together. And I said, but they're married. And he said, the actors aren't married. And we said, but the audience doesn't know that. And the child doesn't know anything. And he said, but it will be played by an 18-year-old girl, because at that time you couldn't have a child less than 18 on the stage. So we said, well, she'll have rehearsed the play. She'll have heard it all in rehearsal. He said, well, I'm sorry, but we're not going to allow that. So you'll have to find some other way of doing it. Could you wheel her off? And first of all, he suggested, could you have a dummy playing her instead of a real child? A sort of Archie Andrews ventriloquist dummy. So we managed to get through that one. And then he said, could we wheel the child off before they start talking about going to bed? And keep her off there until they finish talking about going to bed, and then bring her back on again. So we agreed to this, and in some editions of the play, the early editions of the play, it does say this, and people all over the world are going, what the hell has he been wheeled off for? You know, just for that little period.
So you agreed to it, but you didn't actually do it when it came to
we did it. We did it in the beginning, and then we quickly dropped it, because it was obviously so absurd. You know, and in subsequent editions and productions, it didn't happen. It was a wonderful experience to go there and argue out the filth with the Lord Chamberlain, you know, and his representative. He was called the Comptroller, the Royal Comptroller. And I wrote a play afterwards, quite, you know, in the last 15 years, called Blue Murder, which is a farce that takes place in St James's Palace, where the Busby guard outside is walking up and down with his rifle, and he climbs through the window and kisses the Lord Chamberlain, who is obviously having an affair with him, and the guardsman is a sort of rent boy. You know. So you know, it becomes a completely filthy farce. A very funny play, but it never made it to London.
It's amazing to think that. You know, still for a few years after that, we had someone censoring what could go on the British stage. Extraordinary. Philip, just to bring you in, how did you feel about, you know, when we first talked about you directing this play, how did you feel about, you know, A Day in the Death of Joe Egg, back at the Sits 44 years later? And the second question, I'm really intrigued by, again, watching it tonight, the style of the play is so extraordinary. The sort of mixture of genres. How did you go about approaching that?
Well, how did I feel about doing the play again? the honest truth of it is, I didn't know. I'd done other productions here, and I'd sat in the auditorium during the technical and loved this old, what was the old Princess Theatre, which became the Six, this old variety hall. And I sat in these technicals going, crikey, wouldn't Joe Egg be brilliant in here? And when I suggested it to you, I went and read it again, and I barely picked up, it was premiered in Glasgow. I thought, oh, that's maybe quite an interesting angle. And I realised it was actually premiered here. So it was in some ways a happy accident that was the case. But it's very interesting to me anyway. I mean, certainly on the very first performance, and I was sort of in and out tonight. I can't really watch openings. I've just put people off. But how modern the play feels. Some of you will have seen D.C. Jackson's My Romantic History. People jumping in and out of scenes, talking to the audience, that sort of stuff. And this was a big kind of contemporary hit. And this is doing all of that. It feels very contemporary to me, which is one of the reasons I wanted to do it. It just really makes me laugh every time I read it. I just find it absolutely hilarious. In terms of how I approached it, I think one of the big touchstones for it really was pop art. Certainly when Peter and I discussed the play, he also used that phrase. I thought, that's very interesting. This idea of stepping outside of a frame, which is kind of the central idea, I guess, behind our design, such as it is. You notice even the paintings on the back, they're all kind of busting out of their frames, and then they're literally kind of busting off this pros arch. This idea of these people only able to really talk about their situation when they're kind of outside of their situation. And these are all the kind of the thoughts that are going on. But also there is this idea of a clashing of styles as well in pop art, and taking items from life. Duchamp famously has the urinal, for example, and you put in a different position. You're invited to consider it afresh. Dali's leopard skin nuclear bomber and all that kind of stuff. And so we wanted to try and do what the play was doing. Like pop art, it uses lots of different styles and clashes them against each other, and this play does that. You've got high farce, you've got stand-up comedy, you've got sketches, you've got quite high drama, fado. You've got the lot, in this piece, and this is kind of a very exciting mix, and it was just the wanting really to kind of clash all of those things together, and which I think is that what the play does so excitingly, and it's such a kind of a wonderful, intrinsically theatrical experience.
It's very nice of you to say that, but I must interrupt to say that that hasn't been everybody's view. Joe Orton, who you will know as a great farceur, saw the play about a week before he was battered to death by his lover, and wrote in his diary, which you can read, that he thought my play was facetious and sentimental, and he left at the interval, but he wanted to leave before then. Anyway, he went off and saw his own play just up the road, which he thought was much better, which is characteristic of playwrights. I think I've probably done the same. I mean, I don't entirely disagree with him. I think now, after all these years, I do think there is a sort of slight cowardice about the play. What I do think about it is it's a very good comedy. I think it's, I said to Philip when he started, don't do it like Strindberg, do it like Noel Coward. And apparently he wrote this up in the rehearsal room, Coward, not Strindberg, because people tend to treat it terribly seriously and get solemn about it. But in fact, it's essentially a comedy. Everything works by funny returns, timing, gags. I put jokes into it. There are jokes that other people wrote that I put in. It's not an established. It is established in a funny way. I mean, it's now taken a place where it could be voted one of the big plays of the 20th century by the National Theatre, who have never done it, by the way. It's been done all over the world, and it's been done by extraordinary actors. The last one was Eddie Izzard, Before that was Clive Owen, and so on and so on. Been done all over the world. We've seen it in foreign languages and many times. So it was so odd because I came back from Glasgow saying, 3 weeks in Glasgow, smashing, wonderful theatre, how marvellous, you know. It was a breakthrough for me, it was a stage play. And then about a week later, my agent rang me and said, Albert Finney wants to take it in, darling. Laurence Olivier and Kenneth Tynan want it to be done at the National, and Bernard Delfont wants to do it in the West End. The choice is yours, darling. Bye. So it really was Cinderella goes to the ball.
But why do you think at that time it absolutely, you know, here we are in Glasgow, what happened? I mean, it wasn't reviewed originally by the national papers. What happened, do you think, that made it just sort of catch fire? What is it about it?
I really don't know. I mean, it wouldn't have caught fire. It's one of those things, you know, the theatre, as we all three know, is full of hairbreadth escapes, you know. It's touch and go whether something goes on. And I really thought that was going to be the end of it. 3 weeks in Glasgow, smashing, Citizens Theatre, what could be nicer? Perfect performance. And Michael Blakemore rang from Glasgow and said, have you seen the notice in The Guardian? I said, there's no notice in The Guardian. I was back in Bristol. He said, oh yes there is, it's a rave. And I said, there's only a review of the Oxford University Drama Society doing As You Like It. He said, well, I'm going to ring the editor, which he did. He rang the editor, and it was that chance. He rang the national editor in London and said, you can't ignore this. Your Scottish critic, who was Cordelia Oliver, had given it a great review.
In the Northern edition of
the Scottish edition.
Yeah.
And as a result of it, he got it printed the next day, and as a result of that, everybody came up, and Albert Finney bought it, and Albert Finney went to Broadway with it, and played there, you know, and so that was how it went on.
Just to talk for a minute about the subject matter and the subjects that it deals with, do you feel that those kind of issues, it was like the first time those kind of issues had been discussed on the stage? And how did you feel, because obviously it's very personal for you, but how did you feel about putting them on the stage?
It's so hard to answer that. It was the thing that had happened to me that was most dramatic. Right. And my first impulse when I thought about, you know, you think about plays in terms of images. And the image I had was a man and a woman standing beside a wheelchair talking to a child. And I think that's still the most telling thing in the play, in a way. It's their treatment. But we talk to our daughter as you would talk to a cat. You know, because she didn't understand anything. She didn't begin to feature as a human being. So, you know, we'd say, you know, and then do as they've done tonight, put all these words into her mouth. And I suppose that, you know, it just struck me as terribly funny that we were doing that. And it struck other people as funny too. But I did also notice that when guests came and we said things like, I'm mad, she says, yeah, I'm mad but lovely, and things like that, you know, that these, that people went, so I thought there's some theatrical mileage here, which of course there's proved to be.
Philip, you know, we live in a very politically correct age, though interesting, there's a whole thing the press this week about Ricky Gervais using
yes, exactly, mom.
The word mom on Twitter. Did you have discussions? How did you approach that, if at all, those kind of issues when you were rehearsing the play?
Well, I didn't really. I mean, in the sense that they weren't discussed, like the issues weren't particularly discussed. I mean, they're there, they're in the play, we're doing them. I think, you know, we can kind of think of ourselves as being really progressive. But actually, I kind of thought maybe a 2011 audience might be more easily offendable than a 1967 audience, strangely. And it's really interesting, all of that. 'Cause I like things that, I like things that shock. I like trying to make, you know, and one of the reasons I'm drawn to it is because it's really naughty and cheeky, and it's rude, and makes you think, because, you know, words have no intrinsic value, for goodness sake.
I hate to play with language.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, that people are, you know, resigning left, right and centre for I mean, there are so many more things about the play than the language, but all I wanted us to do was hit it really hard and not apologise. And all I said to the actors who were doing the speeches from particularly Pam's speech, and particularly Pam's speech, was say, assume they agree with you. Assume that they're your best friends and they agree with every word you're saying. And then she sort of did it with a sort of guilelessness, which made it kind of very arresting. Because if there's a sense that Freddie or Pam think that they might be offensive or they might be treading on people's toes, the whole sort of thing dies a bit, really. And so that's how we sort of approached it.
And they are the, you know, when I read the play again, they are the couple you think, oh, I don't know how this will work today to a contemporary audience, but actually, as we saw tonight, audiences find them hysterically funny.
Partly because they feel like that.
Exactly.
You know, Pam speaks for us all.
Yeah. It's people like us.
Unfortunately. And it is interesting you raised that Hmong point. You know, I didn't know anything about the word Hmong, but Ricky Gervais, as you know, is trying to bring back common use of the word Hmong, meaning Mongoloid. And words have changed their meaning so much. I mean, spastic, used in this play, is not a term of abuse, and it never was when I wrote it. And nobody ever. Our child used to go off when she's brought back in the last scene, or in one of the, you know, and the wife calls out, "Thank you." That will be a member of the Spastic Society who have brought her back in a bus, having looked after her all day. Unfortunately, Joe is not even compos mentis enough to help make the ballpoint pens. But it's one of the lines in the play. She says she can help make the ballpoint pen. And you can't help sort of laughing at this pathetic sort of parallel to life. Wheelchair gardening, etc. But I mean, I think Ricky Gervais is on a losing wicket because, you know, when they started, they called it the Spastic Society. They got rid of that because it became a term of abuse. Spastic, called out. Then they changed. Blue Peter did a very good thing of taking a boy who was seriously disabled, and he was called Joe or something. Within a few weeks in the playgrounds, they were calling Joey. You know, you can't win, you know. And whatever you do, bullying and nastiness and prejudice will survive.
Yeah. I said we keep it to 50 minutes, so we're going to stop there. Just to say thank you so much for coming up to Glasgow to sit again and watch your play 40 years later. And thank you, Philip, for your fantastic contemporary production of the play. And thank you all for coming tonight and for staying behind.